The calendar pages turned into 7 years of dust. She wore her widowhood like armor, impenetrable and heavy, convinced that eternal fidelity to a memory was her only virtue. Happiness wasn't merely unwelcome. It was forbidden, an act of sacrilege against the great love that ended too soon. But armor cracks. A persistent, gentle force arrives, challenging the very foundation of her mourning. To feel a simple spark after so long feels wrong, dangerous, yet utterly irresistible. She must now confront a chilling possibility that embracing a future may require an act of betrayal against the profound love that anchored her past. The air inside the Hawthorne residence was perpetually still, cool, and scented faintly with lemon polish and the ghosts of old coffee. The house, a modest Cape Cod, felt less like a home and more like a carefully preserved museum of a life abruptly curtailed. Every object possessed its ordained place, maintained with a meticulousness that bordered on ritualistic fervor. Designed, perhaps, to ward off the chaos that had ripped through the walls 7 years prior. Eleanor Ellie Hayes, 42, moved through the silence with the practiced grace of a sleeper walker. Her dark brown hair was always secured in a low, severe bun, and her clothes were invariably muted. Dark and practical, a uniform of mourning she hadn't dared to shed since summer 2013, the epoch of the profound loss. Her eyes, though tired, held a core of unwavering, albeit misplaced, loyalty. She paused before the mantelpiece, her thumb tracing the smooth, dark curve of the obsidian wedding band perpetually affixed to her left hand. It was more than a ring. It was the physical manifestation of her penance, a declaration that her emotional life had ended the moment Marcus Vance, 38, her vibrant, loving husband, was snatched away by the sudden passing. Beside the band, the centerpiece of the mantel, was the framed lake photograph Marcus. Laughing, sun-drenched, a picture of vitality that contrasted cruelly with the somber reality of the room. He was the standard, the insurmountable height against which all subsequent happiness was measured, and inevitably found lacking. Eleanor was convinced that her grief was the only true homage she could pay. Joy felt like a betrayal. Laughter, a desecration. Her daily pilgrimage led her, as it always did, to Copperfield Books, the neighborhood bookstore. It was a haven of routine, dimly lit, warm and comforting, smelling powerfully of aging paper and roasted espresso beans. Eleanor wasn't a reader of fiction anymore. She managed the inventory and organized the shelves, a predictable sequence of tasks that required presence but not engagement. It was in autumn 2020, amidst the comforting anonymity of the nonfiction aisle, that the rhythm broke. A man was struggling to reach a high shelf, a stack of large hardbacks teetering precariously in his grasp. He was tall, with light ash-blonde hair and a neatly trimmed beard, and his posture was open, almost inviting. "Careful there," Eleanor said, the sound of her own voice startlingly loud in the quiet air. She hadn't engaged in unplanned conversation in months. He turned, smiling immediately. It wasn't a practiced, fleeting smile. It was genuine, reaching his warm, perceptive eyes. This was Owen Miller, 45. "Ah, the gravity gods are testing me today," he responded, his voice warm and light-hearted. He managed to juggle the books, saving the stack just before disaster. "Thank you. I'm Owen. I spent too much time here trying to find forgotten editions of old travelogues." Eleanor felt an unfamiliar, uncomfortable lurch in her chest. His ease was disarming. She should have offered a clipped, professional response and moved on. Instead, she found herself lingering. "Ellie, I work here. The travelogues are on the 3rd shelf, Section B, if you were aiming for the 19th century accounts of the American West," she heard herself say. Owen tilted his head slightly. A subtle gesture that indicated he was truly listening, not just politely waiting for his turn to speak. "You know your inventory. Most people just point toward the back wall. You must genuinely love this place." "I love its silence," she corrected, but the lie felt hollow even as she spoke it. They talked for 5 minutes, maybe 10, about the scent of old bindings, the necessity of sturdy shelving, the strange comfort of predictable solitude. For the first time in 7 years, Eleanor felt a relaxation spread through her shoulders. A momentary reprieve from the relentless weight of her mourning. It was a flicker of joyous sensation so alien, so utterly unexpected, that it felt like an electric shock. This was the coffee shop encounter, the moment the fortress was breached. The moment Owen finally left, promising to return the following week, Eleanor panicked. The unfamiliar lightness curdled instantly into profound guilt. She retreated physically, fleeing the bookstore early and emotionally, slamming shut the door that Owen's presence had inadvertently nudged open. Back in the Hawthorne residence, the silence was suddenly oppressive, accusatory. She stood in the kitchen, trembling slightly, gripping the cold marble countertop. How dare I? The shame was immediate and overwhelming. To feel comfortable around another man, to share a genuine moment of unburdened ease, it felt like a direct act of betrayal to Marcus. Marcus, whose photograph watched her from the mantel. She had consecrated herself to his memory, and this brief, confusing interaction was proof of her spiritual failing. The next morning, Eleanor doubled down on her routine. She wore her darkest dress. She polished the silver frame around the framed lake photograph until it gleamed aggressively. She spent hours meticulously cross-referencing inventory lists. She was reinforcing the walls of her self-imposed emotional quarantine. But Owen was perceptive, patient, and persistent. He didn't text or call. He understood the required distance. Instead, he simply appeared, not forcing conversation, but ensuring she noticed his presence. He wasn't demanding her attention. He was offering his own steady presence as a constant, non-judgmental option. A few days later, she found a small folded piece of thick paper tucked into a poetry volume she was shelving. Inside was the hand-drawn map. It wasn't a map of a town or a journey. It was a rough sketch of the bookstore layout, annotated with funny little comments about the land of misfiled mysteries and the dangerous cliffs of unstable art books. It was a silly, gentle gesture, signifying his ability to see past her reserved exterior and recognize the small acts of service she performed for the store. It was the first gift, however small, she had received that didn't feel like pity or a memorial offering. It brought that confusing, long-dormant feeling, a gentle smile that immediately vanished when she remembered the watchful town. Eleanor felt the external pressure intensely, imagining the judgment emanating from the stone hearth bistro. The bistro, quaint and upscale, sat on the corner of Main Street and acted as the relative's watchpost. Her sister-in-law, a woman who felt deeply protective of Marcus's memory and Eleanor's loyalty to it, often met friends there. Eleanor knew that any deviation from her solemn routine, especially the appearance of Owen, would be dissected, scrutinized, and ultimately condemned as a grievous failure of devotion. The weight of this societal expectation, coupled with her internal guilt, was crushing her nascent hope. The thought of Owen becoming a fixture seemed impossible. She was still married to a memory. She tried to rationalize the feelings away. He was just a kind stranger. The bookstore was a public place, but his light-heartedness kept chipping away at the fortress she had built. The transition from autumn 2020 into winter 2021 brought a biting cold and a layer of fresh snow. Eleanor found herself, slowly and timidly, extending her walks to Willow Creek Trail. It was a quiet, scenic walking path along the frozen river, offering a sense of neutral ground. She went there seeking solitude, but increasingly she found Owen there too, not waiting for her, but simply existing on the path, jogging or reading on a bench. One crisp Saturday morning in early winter 2021, their paths truly converged. Eleanor was bundled in thick wool, the obsidian wedding band cold against her skin. Owen was standing at the edge of the river, tossing small stones across the ice, Ellie, he said, turning. His gaze was steady, free of the nervous pity she usually encountered. Owen, she replied, preparing her standard defense mechanisms. He walked toward her, stopping a respectful distance away. I've been giving you space. I know if you've interrupted something important, but I need to say something just once, and then I'll respect whatever boundary you set. Eleanor braced herself, tightening her grip on her gloves. This was it. The demand she couldn't meet. I see the ring, Owen began softly, his voice echoing slightly in the frosty air. I see the weight you carry, and I know you've been avoiding me because of it. I don't need details, but I see the devotion and the pain. He paused, letting the silence settle. Eleanor felt a strange mix of terror and relief. He saw her. Here is the thing, Ellie, he continued, taking a careful step closer. Whatever beautiful, profound thing you had, that love story, it's not erased by existing. It doesn't get diminished because you smiled at a bad joke, or because you found a moment of ease. Your life continuing is not a slight to the past. It's simply the courageous act of a survivor. Eleanor felt the carefully constructed dam around her emotions begin to tremble. She inhaled the cold, sharp air, her eyes blurring. You don't understand, she whispered, the words ragged. It's been 7 years of believing that if I ever felt this lightness, this potential happiness, I would be telling Marcus that what we had wasn't enough, that he wasn't enough to sustain me forever. It's the ultimate disrespect. Owen listened patiently, allowing the full force of her confession to hang in the air. This was the confrontation on the trail. Ellie, that's not love, Owen stated gently. That's a prison sentence. And Marcus, the vibrant, laughing man in the photograph, wouldn't have wanted that for you. That love story, that beautiful connection, is an indelible part of your foundation. It's an anchor. It grounds you. It keeps you secure. But an anchor is meant to keep the ship safe in the harbor, not keep it chained to the dock forever, afraid to sail again. The analogy hit her with stunning force. An anchor, not a cage. I built the cage, she admitted, tears finally freezing on her cheeks. I was afraid that if I let go of the pain, I would let go of him. The love isn't in the pain, Ellie. It's in the memories, Owen reassured her. And those memories are safe. They are yours. Don't want to replace him or what you had. I want to respect it, honor it, and simply ask if there's room for more life alongside it. He didn't reach out. He maintained the distance, offering her the safety to choose without pressure. His patience was the key that finally turned the lock. He wasn't pushing a new romance. He was compelling her to confront a crucial truth. Her love for Marcus was an asset, a cherished history, but it was never intended to be a weapon of self-punishment. The confrontation was painful, exposing 7 years of suppressed grief and misplaced duty, but it was vital. Eleanor stood there, watching the sunlight glint off the icy river, and for the first time, she saw a path forward that wasn't shadowed by guilt. She started, her voice catching. I don't know how to do this, how to ... to begin again. You don't begin again, Owen said simply. You continue. You build a new wing on the existing structure. You bring the light back into the house. That day, the atmosphere inside the Hawthorne residence began to shift. It wasn't instantaneous. The house still held the quiet reverence of the past, but the silence no longer felt like a demand for solitude. Eleanor still wore the obsidian wedding band, but the meaning had subtly transformed. It was no longer a declaration of unending penance, but a cherished connection to her past self, a symbol of the profound love that had shaped her. Her journey became less about erasing or replacing what was lost, and more about the radical act of allowing her heart to heal and expand. She slowly, tentatively, accepted Owen's presence. Their second chapter didn't begin with grand romantic gestures, but with quiet shared moments back at Copperfield Books, discussing the flaws of the Dewey Decimal System, and later, hesitant walks together on Willow Creek Trail. The fear of judgment from the stone hearth bistro hadn't vanished, but it no longer dictated her choices. Eleanor understood that the opinions of the well-meaning, watchful relatives were irrelevant compared to the vital truth Owen had helped her realize. Happiness was not a finite resource that had to be stolen from Marcus's memory. It was an infinite capacity that she had simply refused to access. One evening, months after the confrontation, Eleanor and Owen were sitting on a bench on the trail, watching the dusk settle. Eleanor reached out, taking his hand, a small yet monumental gesture. Her thumb brushed against the obsidian wedding band. "I thought I had to choose," Eleanor confessed quietly. "Choose between him and life." Owen intertwined their fingers, his warmth a comforting, steady presence beside her. "You chose life, Ellie. That's what Marcus would have chosen for you." Her acceptance was the declaration of continuing life. It was the realization that embracing new love was not an act of forgetting, but a courageous declaration that her story was not over. The 7 years of grief were an indelible part of her history, a painful, necessary anchor. But now, fortified by that history, Eleanor Hayes finally allowed herself to set sail into her second chapter. Hand in hand with Owen Miller, facing a future that was light, open, and miraculously healing. The love she had known was permanent, and the love she was discovering was simply proof that the heart, when given permission, will always find a way to rebuild. The shift from profound self-condemnation to tentative hope did not happen with a grand celestial flourish, but with the quiet, unsettling creak of a heavy door opening for the first time in 7 years. The cold air of Willow Creek Trail carried not just the scent of ice and pine, but the sharp, intoxicating, and terrifying smell of possibility. Following the confrontation, the space between Eleanor and Owen, once a respectful chasm, became a shared, cautious clearing. Ellie had articulated her greatest fear, that happiness was an insult to Marcus, and Owen had met it. Not with dismissal, but with validation and a radical redefinition of loyalty. The immediate aftermath was messy. Ellie didn't suddenly shed her dark woolens or discard the obsidian wedding band. Instead, she brought her deeply entrenched habits into this new, fragile space. She found herself watching Owen with unnerving intensity, waiting for the shoe to drop, waiting for him to demand an impossible speed of recovery, or to mock the depth of her lingering grief. But Owen did neither. He understood that a woman who had spent 7 years building a fortress could not simply walk out its front gate. Their interactions remained anchored to Copperfield books, but the context had changed completely. Now, when Owen came in, he didn't just browse. He lingered near the counter, meticulously examining the new arrivals or engaging Ellie in long, meandering conversations about history and travel topics entirely outside the scope of inventory management. One afternoon, a week after their talk on the trail, Owen was detailing the arduous process of tracing a family history through obscure municipal records. Ellie found herself laughing, a genuine, unforced burst of sound that felt foreign and brittle in the hushed bookstore. The laugh stopped abruptly, choked off by the memory of Marcus's booming, joyful laughter. The internal prosecutor instantly materialized, whispering accusations of frivolity and forgetting. Ellie's face went stiff, her cheeks flushing with immediate shame. She instinctively touched the cold metal of her wedding band, grounding herself back in the solemn reality she had chosen. Owen noticed the sudden withdrawal. He didn't ask what was wrong, nor did he apologize for the levity. He simply paused, looking at her with those steady, perceptive eyes. "It's a good sound, Ellie," he said softly, continuing to look at the book in his hands, giving her the dignity of not staring at her distress. "It doesn't need permission. It feels loud," she managed, her voice barely a breath. "No, it feels honest. And honest sounds are rare these days." That conversation, more than any grand romantic overture could have been, marked the true beginning of their tentative understanding. Owen wasn't trying to make her forget. He was creating a safe harbor where she could practice being present without fearing the past. The Hawthorne residence, meanwhile, was slowly, imperceptibly, shedding its cloak of perpetual winter. Ellie still maintained the rigorous order, but the purpose behind the routine had shifted. It was no longer penance. It was preservation. The framed lake photograph remained on the mantelpiece. Marcus's vibrant image still dominated the room, but Ellie started focusing on the joy captured in the image rather than the agonizing finality of the date. She realized the profound, terrifying truth: grieving Marcus did not require her to negate the possibility of future happiness. True honoring meant living the life he would have wanted for her, not the one dictated by her guilt. This newfound shaky equilibrium was tested not by Owen but by the relentless gaze of the outside world. The problem wasn't Owen's intentions or Ellie's desires. The problem was the narrative that the community had written for her 7 years ago, a narrative of the tragic, loyal widow, frozen in time. Any deviation felt like tearing up the script. Eleanor's sister-in-law, a woman named Carol, was the self-appointed custodian of Marcus's memory. Carol genuinely loved Ellie, but she saw Ellie's continued isolation as the highest form of respect for her deceased brother. The Stone Hearth Bistro, a quaint, upscale establishment in the town centre, was Carol's preferred meeting place. It occupied the town's most visible corner, making it the relatives' watch-post. A place where a single sighting could trigger a torrent of concerned whispered calls. Owen, perhaps understanding that true healing required moving past mere whispers and into the daylight, gently pressed the issue of visibility.
"I need no boots,"
he mentioned casually one cold Friday afternoon at Copperfield Books. "I was thinking of walking over to the outdoor supply store on Main Street past the square. Would you join me for a coffee after?" Ellie's stomach plummeted. Main Street, the square. Close proximity to the Stone Hearth Bistro. "Owen, I can't," she replied instantly, the old walls snapping back into place. "I have inventory reconciliation." "You finished that 3 hours ago," he noted, without judgment. "Ellie, you're practicing being happy in secret. That's exhausting. We don't have to hold hands or discuss poetry. We just need to walk side by side in the same public air, breathing the same air everyone else is breathing." The simplicity of his request, "just walk side by side," was devastating. It highlighted the depth of her confinement. "It's the scrutiny," she confessed, staring down at the obsidian wedding band. "Carol, others. They see loyalty as a lack of movement. They see me still wearing this ring, still living in the house, and they assume the rest of me is consecrated. If they see me with you, they will see a woman who survived something terrible and has decided to live again," Owen countered gently. "If their judgment is the wall you're hitting, we have to walk through it, not around it. Let's start small, just the walk. We can get takeout coffee and avoid the bistro entirely." Ellie hesitated, the internal conflict raging. To step out publicly with Owen felt like tearing off her self-imposed veil of mourning. It felt aggressive, defiant, and yet thrillingly necessary. The alternative was a lifetime of hiding a tentative, fragile joy. "All right," she said finally, the word rough and forced. "But if I see Carol, I am crossing the street, immediately." Owen smiled, a genuine, relieved smile that made the fear feel a little less paralyzing. "Understood. We can make a run for it if necessary." The walk that followed was a masterclass in nervous energy. Ellie felt every set of eyes on Main Street drilling into her back. She kept her hands stuffed deep into her pockets, careful not to brush Owen's arm. They spoke only in clipped, necessary sentences, discussing the architecture of the old library and the absurdity of local politics. As they reached the square, the Stone Hearth Bistro stood dominant on the corner, its large windows offering a clear view of the interior and, crucially, a clear view of the sidewalk. Ellie's breath hitched. There she was, sitting at a table by the window, flanked by 2 other well-known pillars of their small community, the watchpost fully operational. Carol's back was initially to the street, but just as Ellie and Owen passed the entrance, Carol turned her head, gesturing animatedly. Her eyes landed directly on Ellie. The animated smile froze. Carol's expression transformed instantly from friendly gossip to cold, calculated shock, followed by a hardening of the mouth that Ellie knew well. It was the look of protective condemnation, the silent accusation. "How dare you?" Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. She was caught. This was worse than a confrontation. It was a photographic moment of betrayal. She wanted desperately to pull Owen's arm and sprint, to disappear back into the quiet anonymity of Copperfield books. Owen, however, felt her tension spiked and, without looking at the bistro, slowed his pace. Instinctively placing himself slightly closer to Ellie, acting as a shield without being obvious. "They see us, don't they?" Ellie whispered, her jaw tight. "Likely," Owen affirmed calmly. "Breathe, Ellie. You are walking down a public sidewalk with an acquaintance, that is all. No, they see the ring. They see me, and they know the loyalty I owe. This is a betrayal, Owen. Look at her face." Owen stopped walking. They were directly in front of the bistro's plate glass window. The tableau inside Carol and her friends, frozen like statuary, was now fully visible. Owen turned, facing Ellie, effectively putting his back to the onlookers. But his movement forced Ellie to face the street and the public gaze. "They do not define your loyalty, Ellie," Owen said, his voice low, firm, and entirely devoid of pressure, yet demanding attention. "You define your loyalty. And that ring, that symbol of the profound love you shared, is a testament to the life you lived. Not a mortgage on the life you were allowed to live." Ellie felt the public scrutiny pressing in, the air thick with unspoken judgment. This was the moment. The 7 years of penance had reached their zenith. Forcing a crisis point, remain imprisoned by the perceived demands of the past, or risk the wrath of those who confuse grief with stagnation. Tears sprang to her eyes, not of sadness, but of pure adrenaline-fueled anger at her own weakness. She felt the fierce, protective love she had for Marcus. And for the first time, she recognized that this love was being weaponized by herself and by others against her survival. She stared past Owen, looking directly through the glass at Carol. For a long, intense moment, their eyes locked. Carol's expression remained stony, unwavering in its judgment. And then, something monumental shifted within Ellie. The feeling of shame began to dissolve, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. Marcus was gone. His story was finished, beautifully and tragically. But her story was still being written. She was accountable only to the indelible love they had shared, not to the external performance of eternal mourning. Ellie reached out, trembling slightly, and grasped Owen's wrist. It was a small, almost desperate gesture, but it was a deliberate, public declaration of alignment. "Let's go," she said, her voice stronger than she anticipated. "I need that coffee." She didn't run. She didn't hide. She straightened her spine, raised her chin, and walked past the Stone Hearth Bistro side by side with Owen, their movement deliberately measured. She could feel Carol's stare until they turned the corner, but the power of that stare had been neutralized. Ellie had chosen life, in the full view of those who expected her to remain a statue of grief. This confrontation, though silent, was the necessary turning point. It was the moment she publicly confronted the perceived betrayal and realized that the only genuine betrayal would be to extinguish her own flame out of fear. They found a small, discreet coffee shop several blocks away. The coffee was scalding, but the warmth in her hands felt restorative. Ellie sat opposite Owen, still vibrating from the encounter, but a deep, unfamiliar calm was starting to settle. "That was hard," she admitted, swirling the foam in her cup. "It was necessary," Owen replied. He didn't offer praise or analysis, just quiet, steady affirmation. "I was so afraid of disappointing her. Disappointing Marcus." "You didn't disappoint Marcus," Owen reiterated patiently. "You honored him by refusing to let his death take your whole future, too." The reality of that statement resonated deeply. The 7 years of pain had felt obligatory, but now the choice felt deliberate. She hadn't been living. She had been existing in Marcus's mausoleum. Over the next few months, As winter 2021 deepened and then slowly gave way to the first hints of spring, Ellie and Owen continued their slow dance of discovery. Their relationship was built on a foundation of profound respect and quiet understanding, recognizing that one heart must hold two loves. Owen never tried to fill the void left by Marcus. He simply created a new, expansive space beside it. He learned about Marcus, the loud laughter, the way he could fix anything, the cherished memories captured in the framed lake photograph. Ellie, in turn, learned how to integrate her past without letting it consume her present. One rainy Saturday, they were curled up in the small living room of the Hawthorne residence. The house no longer felt silent, but quiet, filled with the sound of the rain and Owen's low voice reading aloud from a travelogue. Ellie looked up at the mantel. The photograph of Marcus was still there, vibrant and happy, but now it didn't feel like an accusation. It felt like a foundation. She slipped her hand into her pocket, tracing the distinct, cool shape of the obsidian wedding band. She still wore it every day. It was still a declaration, but the meaning had matured. It was no longer a declaration of unending emotional quarantine. It was a declaration of the depth of her capacity to love. She had spent years believing that if she removed the ring, she would be erasing Marcus. But Owen had shown her that true connection was in the heart, not on the finger. The decision to keep wearing the ring was now entirely hers, an acknowledgement of her history, not a barrier to her future. A few weeks later, when the earliest spring buds were appearing on Willow Creek Trail, Owen arranged a dinner. Not at the Stone Hearth Bistro, but at a quiet, unpretentious place on the outskirts of town. It wasn't a formal date. It was an act of continued public affirmation. Before they left the Hawthorne residence, Ellie stood in front of the hallway mirror, adjusting the soft, cream-colored scarf she wore. She was wearing a deep sapphire dress, the first time she had worn anything lighter than charcoal in years. She looked at her left hand. The obsidian wedding band was stark against her pale skin. Owen came up behind her, placing his hands lightly on her shoulders. "You look beautiful, Ellie," he murmured. She leaned back against his solid presence. "I realized something," she said quietly, looking at the ring. "I don't need to take this off to prove I've moved on. I need to take the shame off. Instead, this ring and Marcus's memory, they taught me what true love feels like. And that lesson is why I am brave enough to hold your hand now." She turned, facing him fully. This was the true final moment of the declaration of continuing life. It was a conscious decision, informed by pain, but dictated by hope. "Thank you, Owen," she said, her voice clear, "for not demanding a blank slate, for understanding that the second chapter doesn't erase the first." Owen simply touched her cheek, his thumb gently wiping away a stray tear that had escaped, a tear that was a mixture of residual grief and blossoming gratitude. "The heart doesn't replace Ellie. It expands," he responded. They left the Hawthorne residence, walking out into the gentle spring evening. The air felt fresh, alive, and utterly hopeful. Later that night, after returning home, Ellie stood by the mantelpiece. She looked at Marcus's laughing face in the framed lake photograph. She realized that for years she had been holding her breath, waiting for the 7 years of mourning to be over, as if grief were a finite sentence she had to serve. She touched the ring one last time, a gesture of peace and profound respect. The love she had shared with Marcus was an eternal flame, warm and true, and it resided safely within her. It had not been a cage. And now she was free to love again. Took a deep, steady breath, the sound settling comfortably into the quiet house. Eleanor Hayes, the widow, the survivor, the woman whose heart had finally healed and expanded, walked away from the mantelpiece and into the warmth of the living room, ready to embrace the quiet, steady future that Owen Miller represented, a future not of forgetting, but of courageously continuing. Her story was a testament not to the finality of loss, but to the infinite capacity of the heart to rebuild. The chill of winter 2021 settled over the small town, mirroring the slow, careful process unfolding within Eleanor. The weeks following the walk past the Stone Hearth Bistro were quiet, but the silence at the Hawthorne residence no longer felt absolute. It was punctuated by the gentle, deliberate rhythm of Owen's presence. He had become a careful, predictable fixture. He never pushed past the boundaries Ellie defined, but he meticulously moved them closer to genuine connection. Ellie realized the true courage in Owen wasn't his willingness to risk judgment, but his patience in waiting for her to dismantle the inner architecture of her grief, brick by painstaking brick. Owen's first invitation into the Hawthorne residence was simple. He needed to fix a dripping faucet in her kitchen, a task she had allowed to persist for months, almost as a form of self-punishment for maintaining a comfortable life. The sight of Owen in her kitchen, a place historically consecrated to Marcus's memory and Ellie's solitude, was jarring. He wore practical jeans and a worn flannel shirt, his posture open and unhurried as he knelt under the sink. He whistled softly, a tuneless, easy sound that cut through the strained silence of the house. Ellie watched him from the doorway, holding a mug of cooling tea. She felt the familiar grip of guilt tighten in her chest, whispering that Marcus would have fixed the faucet immediately, that this intrusion of new comfort was disrespectful. "Ellie?" Owen asked, his voice muffled by the pipes. "Pass me the adjustable wrench, will you? The big silver one." She did, crossing the threshold fully. She stood beside him for a moment, the smell of grease and damp metal replacing the usual faint scent of dust and lavender sachet that defined the house. "You don't have to watch," he murmured, not looking up. "I know," she replied. "It just feels strange, having someone here. I'm just tightening a valve, Ellie. I'm not rearranging the furniture. It's not the furniture. It's the air," she whispered. "Marcus was everywhere in this house. Now, it feels like the walls are holding their breath." Owen finally extracted himself from beneath the sink, his face smudged. He sat back on his heels, turning to face her fully. He didn't wipe his hands. "Marcus is everywhere here, Ellie." "That's okay," Owen said, his gaze steady. "Haze in the quiet organization of your shelves, in the way the light hits that photograph on the mantel, in the way you instinctively save the last bite of a meal. My presence doesn't dilute that. It just means the house is getting a little bigger, making room for another story that isn't about him, but is influenced by him." He picked up the wrench again, a definitive end to the brief emotional interlude. This was Owen's genius. Validation and practicality. Simultaneously, he acknowledged the ghost but refused to let it halt the necessary mundane business of living. Slowly, carefully, the Hawthorne residents started to integrate Owen. He never entered the room where Marcus's clothes were still stored, a boundary. Ellie never had to articulate. He just understood. But he brought his own small, innocuous additions, a stack of esoteric history books on the coffee table, a pair of sturdy hiking boots near the back door, and occasionally the faint, lingering scent of pine in cold air. Ellie began to recognize that the meticulous order she had maintained for 7 years was, at its core, an attempt to freeze time. If nothing moved, Marcus's absence felt less real. But Owen's presence was a warm, persistent stream, proving that movement didn't mean eradication. Their routine expanded beyond Copperfield books and the Willow Creek Trail. They started taking short drives to neighboring towns, exploring antique stores or quiet remote diners. These excursions were crucial. Away from the town center and the watchful eyes of the watchpost, Ellie allowed herself moments of genuine lightness. One afternoon, while browsing a dusty map shop in an unfamiliar village, Owen paused, his finger tracing a winding, faded path. He bought the Mapan old, slightly damaged reproduction of a local survey from the 1950s and folded it carefully. Later that week, back at Copperfield Books, he presented it to Ellie. It was not the hand-drawn map required by the constraints, but rather a preparatory step toward it. "What is this?" she asked, unfolding the brittle paper. "It's the old layout of Willow Creek Trail and the surrounding forest," he explained. "Look at the path we usually take, the main loop. See how short it is? Ellie nodded, tracing the familiar line. See these faint dotted lines? Owen continued, pointing to tiny, almost invisible notations that branched off the main trail into denser woods. Those are the lost paths. They're overgrown, hard to find, maybe a bit dangerous. But they lead to new perspectives, new views of the river. And the original cartographers marked them as the most rewarding. He didn't need to elaborate. The map was a perfect metaphor for her life. The main loop was the 7 years of routine and prescribed grief. The dotted lines were the terrifying yet promising paths of vulnerability and new possibility. They look like dead ends, Ellie observed, running her finger over a particularly faint line. Only if you stop walking, Owen countered gently. He took the map back, pulling a fine-tipped pen from his jacket. Over the old map, he meticulously drew a new layer. He added annotations about the current state of the paths, marking obstacles, clearings, and potential viewpoints, creating the hand-drawn map. It was personalized, insightful, and profoundly empathetic. "This is for you," he said, handing the customized map back. "When you feel stuck on the loop, remember that you have the internal compass to find the rest of the forest. The goal isn't to forget the main trail. It's just to recognize that it's not the only one." The gift resonated with Ellie deeper than any expensive piece of jewelry could have. It was a recognition that her healing journey was complex, requiring navigation, not demolition. The hand-drawn map became a talisman, kept tucked into the journal she had begun filling again, not with mournful poetry, but with observations and tentative plans. As the quiet integration continued, the central conflict, the perceived betrayal of Marcus, had to be faced head-on, not just in public defiance, but in private honesty. One Saturday night, they were sitting on the couch in the Hawthorne residence. The framed lake photograph, Marcus vibrant and laughing on their honeymoon, dominated the mantel. Owen had never actively avoided looking at it, but tonight, Ellie felt compelled to bring Marcus fully into the room. "He loved that lake," Ellie said softly, staring at the picture. "He loved the cold water and the way the pines smelled after a storm." Owen followed her gaze. He didn't flinch or try to change the subject. "It's a beautiful picture," Owen agreed. "He looks like a man who was very easy to love." He was. Ely's voice caught, thick with lingering emotion. "I keep thinking, if he could see me now, laughing with you, letting you into this house, past those 7 years. I keep imagining his judgment." Owen shifted his weight, turning to face her completely. "What do you think he'd say?" Ellie swallowed, the question forcing her to confront the projected narrative she had built around Marcus's memory. "I think I built him up into this perfect, eternally grieving ideal. A man who would want me to be a faithful statue, unchanging. But was he that kind of man when he was alive?" Owen asked. "The vibrant man in that photograph? The man who loved life and joy?" Ellie shook her head slowly. "No. He was the most fiercely protective person I knew. He wanted my happiness above all else, even above his own comfort." "Then why would his death suddenly change his deepest wish for you?" Owen pressed, his voice gentle but insistent. "The betrayal isn't in loving again, Ellie. The betrayal would be allowing his memory to starve you of life. He gave you a love story that ended too soon. But that love story equipped you to recognize true kindness and connection when it finally showed up again. He didn't lock the cage, Ellie. You did. And he would want you to open it." The simple truth of it landed like a heavy stone. Marcus hadn't asked for 7 years of penance. Ellie had imposed it on herself, driven by a guilt that confused mourning with martyrdom. The emotional clearing was significant. That night, for the first time, Ellie slept soundly, the silence of the house replaced by a quiet, steady peace. As winter 2021 deepened towards spring, the physical manifestation of her loyalty, the obsidian wedding band, remained. It was a constant presence, cool and smooth against her finger. The public confrontation had changed its function from a shackle of penance to a symbol of history. But there was still a final, critical step in her emotional liberation. Ellie had always believed that to fully embrace Owen, she would have to physically remove the ring, signaling a complete severing of the past. But Owen had taught her that love was not a zero-sum game. The decision was not about replacing Marcus, but about integrating the truth that she was now a woman who loved two men, one eternally gone, one vividly present. One clear, cold afternoon, Ellie was alone at the Hawthorne residence. The small sliver of late winter sun streamed into the living room, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. She sat in the armchair, holding her left hand up to the light. The obsidian wedding band looked heavy, dark, and utterly beautiful. She remembered the day Marcus placed it on her finger, the lightness of his touch, the fierce commitment in his eyes. It was a perfect encapsulation of their commitment. She had spent 7 years using it to communicate to the world, and to herself, that she was taken, unavailable, sealed off. She slid the ring off. It came free easily, yet the absence felt profound, a physical manifestation of a psychological shift. Her finger, pale beneath where the dark stone had rested, felt exposed. The removal was not a definitive break. It was a conscious recontextualization. She didn't discard it or hide it. Instead, she walked over to the mantelpiece. She picked up the framed lake photograph, the image of Marcus, vital and joyful. Beneath the glass, on the thick paper border, she gently placed the obsidian wedding band. It rested there, dark and quiet, next to his image. It was no longer a declaration of her present unavailability, it was an artifact of a finished, beautiful story. A symbol of the anchor, safely moored, allowing her to sail forward. She looked at the assembly. Marcus's life, encapsulated by the photograph and the ring. They were still cherished, still foundational, but they were no longer regulating her breath. The act felt liberating, not terrifying. It was the final, quiet declaration of continuing life, performed not for the world, but for the self. When Owen arrived later that evening, he saw the change immediately, though he couldn't yet see her hand. Ellie was wearing a soft grey sweater, and the light felt different around her. She was smiling, easily, truly present. He sat beside her, not commenting on the palpable shift in the atmosphere of the house. She reached out and placed her hand on his knee, the movement natural and unforced. Owen looked down at her hand and then up at her face, his expression completely neutral, waiting for her lead. "I moved something today," she said, her voice steady. He followed her gaze to the mantelpiece. He saw the photograph, and beside it, resting gently against the frame, the obsidian wedding band. "It looks right there," Owen observed softly, like a quiet promise that was kept. "It was," Ellie confirmed. "A promise to love him fully, for the time we had. And I did. But I realized that the promise wasn't conditional on me serving a life sentence of solitude. The love I have for him doesn't shrink the space in my heart. It's what taught my heart how to expand, how to be brave enough for a second chapter." She took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. Her ungarnished ring finger felt light, unburdened. "I'm starting to think about travel again, Owen," she said, referencing the conversations they used to have at Copperfield Books. "Maybe those obscure municipal records tracing, maybe that's a new path." Owen smiled, a slow, deep smile that reached his perceptive eyes. "I know a good co-pilot for those lost paths. The ones marked on your hand-drawn map." "I'm ready for the lost paths," Ellie declared. As the days warmed and the first tenacious spring flowers pushed through the thawing ground around Willow Creek Trail, Ellie and Owen solidified their bond. Their relationship wasn't characterized by dramatic romance, but by the profound security of knowing and being known. They walked the trail often now, sometimes straying slightly off the main loop, following the faint suggestions on the hand-drawn map. Ellie's internal landscape had transformed. The overwhelming guilt had subsided, replaced by gratitude for the love she had shared with Marcus, and an exhilarating sense of possibility for the life she was building with Owen. She understood now that loving Owen was not an act of forgetting, but the ultimate act of self-preservation and courageous continuation. Her loyalty to Marcus remained indelible, a cherished, beautiful anchor. But anchors are meant to hold ships safely in harbor only long enough to prepare them for the next voyage. Eleanor Hayes, no longer solely defined by the tragedy of her past, stepped fully into the light of her second chapter, her hand resting securely in Owen's, ready to navigate the uncharted, hopeful waters of a love that had courageously returned. The house, the town, the world, all looked a little brighter now, no longer viewed through the permanent shadow of profound loss, but through the vital clarity of a heart that had learned to heal and thrive. Lock in the like and subscribe for more.